Good afternoon and welcome to another special webinar. This talk is part of the Business Horizon series that we're hosting on behalf of the UK Space Agency. My name is Asia Bulgarini. I'm an associate business consultant at Grey Consultants. I am delighted to be your host for today's webinar. Today's topic is about how businesses can come together to benefit from a shared sustainability practice. I just want to run through the house rules ahead of introducing our panelists and guests for today. This session is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch again. If you need any technical assistance, chat with the tech support by clicking on the chat button. And if you'd like subtitles, you can enable them by selecting live transcript from the menu bar. And note, you can also change the size. You can ask questions to the panel throughout the event by submitting them in the Q&A box on the menu bar. And we really encourage you to be engaged and interactive as much as possible with our fantastic panel today. So with that, let me introduce today's awesome lineup. Joining us today, we have Dominic, who's the Business Development Manager at SHD Composite Materials. Welcome, Dominic.
Hello, good afternoon.
We also have Kumar, who's Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs for UK and Europe at Astroscale. Hi, Kumar.
Hi, good afternoon.
We also have Hira, who's the founder and CEO of LumiSpace. Welcome. And we also have Lee, who's Investment Associate at Mercia Asset Management. Hi, Lee.
Hi, everyone.
And with that, I'm going to ask Dominic to please introduce yourself and tell us about SHD Composites and why sustainability is important in the materials industry.
Thank you, Asia. Thank you to UK Space Agency and to Grey Consultancy for giving me this opportunity to present today. Just a very quick introduction to SHD Composites. So we were founded in 2010. We're headquartered in Sleaford in Lincolnshire. We are a manufacturer of composite materials for use in lightweight composite components and composite tooling across many different sectors. We manufacture out of the UK, but also in the EU and in the USA. We're AS9100 Rev D, and we have a corporate focus on sustainability. Sustainability is a very broad subject matter. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But from an SHD perspective, we are looking at reducing the reliance on fossil-derived raw materials in favour of replacing those with more sustainably sourced raw materials derived either from crop waste or through waste product streams. It's, as I mentioned, a very broad subject matter, but ultimately within the world of composite materials, we're not able to affect the performance, the cost and the weight of the materials. And so our focus is very much around the whole supply chain in terms of how we term this as the routes to circularity. We are very much in the adoption phase at the moment. We have a range of bio-based materials which we are working with multiple different sectors in terms of testing and approvals. But at the moment, it's around developments in performance, trying to drive down costs through supply chain and ensuring that we can meet the very sort of specific challenges of composite materials in space, such as extremes of temperature, the effects of launch, things like mechanical and shock, vibration. Obviously, outgassing of polymer materials is a well-known issue. So looking at removing volatiles and obviously the sort of durability and the validation of performance. So that's a very quick snapshot as to who we are and what we do. If anybody has any questions, then feel free to put those in the chat section and I'll be happy to try and answer those for you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Dominic. And yes, I'd like to ask you actually a pre-supplied question from our audience. Are there certain materials or chemicals that the space industry should be phasing out? Are there alternatives?
Yes, it's a really great question. And there's been a huge push towards sustainability with all of the government drive towards net zero by 2050. But prior to the sort of focus switching to sustainability, regulatory compliance has been a massive focus for the polymer industry over the last decade and a half. And a traditional material used in the space sector would be a phenolic-based composite material. Phenolics are very good in terms of fire smoke toxicity performance, very good in ablative performance, utilizing a broad range of lightweight components within space applications. But unfortunately, due to the reaction of the phenol and the formaldehyde, which goes into manufacturing these phenolic resins, there are volatiles which are carcinogenic, and the European Chemical Agency have really put very tight controls on their use due to those health and safety concerns. As it happens, SHD is developing bio-based alternatives to phenolics, which are regulatory compliant and 100% bio-based. So we're very much sort of supporting that transition and that phase away from these carcinogenic materials to more sustainable options.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's hear now from Kumar, who is going to talk about Astroscale and the role it plays to ensure sustainability in the space environment.
Thank you, Asia. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the organizers for inviting Astroscale. Just a brief word about Astroscale. Astroscale Limited is a UK company. It was about 1 person in 2017. We're now approaching 100 in the UK. Our offices are in Harwell. It's part of a multi-country group with headquarters in Japan. Our core business is to develop and promote and enable space sustainability solutions, in particular in orbit servicing of LEO spacecraft and geostationary orbit spacecraft. And it's great that the UK Space Agency facilitated this event as well. Rather than giving you details about what Astroscale is doing, what I thought I would do at this presentation with this one slide is to identify or try to identify why it is we're working in this sector. And the company's basic mission is to find solutions to enable sustainable use of space, of the space environment. And that's largely driven by an historical increase in the number of space debris objects in space. So around 1957, before the Sputnik was launched, there was probably 0 to 1 man-made object in space. Now that number is north of 10,000 in terms of satellites dead or actually active. And if you consider small debris, which has accumulated over the years, over 30, 40, 50 years, with an increase in recent years, according to ESA, you have something like 900,000 to 1 million space debris bits flying around space at great speeds, in particular in LEO orbits. At the same time, and especially in recent years, you've had this very large increase in number of LEO satellites, ranging from CubeSats to larger satellites being launched. And Euroconsult, I think, put out a report late last year, which suggested something like approaching 20,000 LEO satellites would be launched. So the picture on the left is essentially something which you'll find on the NASA website at that link. For those of you who are interested, there's something called the Kessler syndrome, which is basically a domino effect, which eventually becomes, hits a tipping point. And you generate progressively, initial set of debris generates more debris, which then generates yet more debris. And then that can or would render parts of the orbital resource unusable. And there's a link there to the video, which is actually quite good. It's a layman's video. It's in very straightforward English, not too technical. So I'd encourage anybody to have a look at that. So basically the company, and actually not just us, many people in the world believe there's increasing hazards in space. And since this is an event in the UK government has, for quite a long time, been in the vanguard of promoting regulation and policies which are aimed to try to reduce and mitigate this emerging problem. We believe actually that the UK should continue to do that, and it's very well positioned to take a global lead. We think that actually this is not a problem. One can kick down into sort of the latter part of this decade and long grass it. It is an activity which should be urgently addressed, and it needs some strong action by governments and regulators in particular. And I think the objective here is to achieve a situation where we don't see a continuation of a progressive degradation in the orbital resource, which will render it not possible in some orbits for high value space systems to provide valuable services to governments, consumers, institutions on Earth. And recently, the multi-stakeholder organization called the Paris Peace Forum issued a declaration, which was that there should be a net zero space sustainable development goal, which is essentially to aim for, by concrete actions, the sustainable use of space by a date 2030. So it's the first time an international organization has actually established a date, and it sets a target. And there are three basic things which people can do, and operators can do, and governments can do, which is to stop generating more space debris, start removing the hazardous space debris, and ultimately encourage, or in inverted commas, require satellite operators to act more sustainability. And satellite operators includes ourselves, Astroscale, plus probably several thousand other small and large operators out there. And it may not be the most politic thing to say, but what we actually do think is that there needs to be tougher regulations on the industry, which encourages, with a carrot and stick approach, this change in behavior, which we think is important. And that probably will involve some form of economic incentives, which I'm happy to answer in the chat. There is a logo at the back, which is our logo for Net Zero Space, and it's really intended to help simplify what is sometimes a complicated message to the general public and to senior politicians, that there is a problem in space and we need to achieve something akin to net zero on Earth to make that orbital environment sustainable going forward. And thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Kumar. And the question our audience would like to ask you is there a market for space debris removal?
Yes, we obviously believe so. It was actually the first question I asked when I came for an interview with Astroscale. And I think the company has convinced me, and actually our investors, we have about 300 million in investment dollars into the company. So serious investors have looked at us, including, for example, Serafin, which is a leading investment firm in the UK. Maybe one way to answer this is if you separate the market for space debris removal, you have basically satellites in geostationary orbit, which sometimes fail in orbit, and they are not able to be graveyarded into the so-called graveyard orbit. And therefore, in that situation, there is certainly a market for removing those dead geostationary satellites, or possibly extending their life by bringing fuel, like a petrol tanker, to them to fill them up. So our sister company in the US is working in that regard, on a service called Lexi. From the UK and the Japan sides of the company, let me answer your question this way. If you approximately believe the projections of a reputable consultancy such as Euroconsult, that by 2030, about 20,000 LEO satellites will be launched. And obviously not all of them are going to work. So let's make an assumption, and I'll do this off the top of my head. 5% of them might fail. Okay, so 5% of 20,000 is 1,000 satellites which fail in LEO at some point in time over the next few years. Now, whether it is 5%, 2.5%, 7.5%, time will tell. But that's a substantial number of dead satellites, which one is potentially leaving in orbits, which can become hazardous or could just remain there for decades if nothing is done, depending on where they are positioned. So if you look at that in terms of the scale of what percentage of future LEO satellites could become candidates, in inverted commas, for debris removal, that gives you one sense of the scale of the market. The other aspect is all of these satellites, which are basically being launched are being launched into, essentially everybody's jumping into the same swimming pool, where on the one hand you have maybe up to 30,000 satellites of some various sizes, and on the other hand you have up to 1 million pieces of debris in the same swimming pool. And things are going to crash into each other at some point in time. And when they do, you're going to create more debris. So the question is, what is the risk profile in that situation? And I think recent papers have shown that the risks of collisions and either serious damaging collisions or catastrophic collisions is going up. So we certainly believe that the world has to deal with this. And in the coming years, the business plan for this will be, I think, demonstrated to many stakeholders going forward. And there's a lot of investment coming into this sector.
Thank you, Kumar. And still on the topic of sustainability in the space environment, Hira, can you please give us an overview of LUMI Space and its really precise tools for space situational awareness? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Asia. Good afternoon, everybody. Now, it could be a classical Greek tragedy that as humanity, at the same time as destroying the land, the air, and the sea, that we're locking ourselves into the planet via irresponsible use of space. And while debris threatens every satellite in orbit, the sky is not falling in yet. So what this requires is for us to look very carefully at the problem to ensure a sustainable future. Satellites underpin everything we do as a modern society, but current space practices are unsustainable. We've seen several nation states performing anti-satellite tests, which have proliferated a huge amount of debris that does pose a huge threat to our future space activity. Now, we make a good deal of use of data looking from space at our planet across time and spectrum, but there are not many people looking up to ensure that we can look down safely for the foreseeable future. In my view, sustainability is all about mindset. And it's an unfortunate side effect with many aspects of globalization and internationalization that agreeing upon norms and best practices that are sustainable is somewhere between difficult and impossible. The industry has known about space debris for more than 50 years, but international guidelines are just that, guidelines which cannot realistically be enforced. So what we're working on at LUMI is satellite laser ranging, the most precise method of finding the positions and velocities of satellites in orbit. What we do is we shine short laser pulses from the ground to satellites and space debris, time the round trip, and that gives us a very precise distance. And this isn't some net novel technology. These have been operating in a real world context since the 1960s, including ranging of the moon. The difficulty is right now when a satellite operator receives a warning about a potential collision, they ignore it. And there are far too many warnings. The warnings that satellite operators receive are 99.9% false positive. By increasing the accuracy and precision of that information, we reduce uncertainty and give actionable insights, reducing that 99% uncertainty to 5 or 10%. And that, in my view, is the core of sustainability for the space sector. I think we've all seen what sustainable doesn't look like, and it's going to require us all to work together in order to actually enable a sustainable future in space. Thank you.
Thank you, Hira. Are there too many objects already in orbit?
Yes, well, there are too many pieces of debris that we cannot track. I think.
Yeah, you were on me.
Sorry, I think, yeah, I'm having a slight issue on this end. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. Yes, we
Okay,
can.
thanks. Yeah, I've lost control of my Zoom, but as long as it's working. So there are not too many objects in orbit. There are too many objects in orbit for current practices. There are not too many objects in orbit for a sustainable future. What we need is to change our practices. The orbit carrying capacity that we see But I think as we evolve the technology that underpins, we can have a sustainable future with 100,000 satellites in low Earth orbit, as long as, for example, as Kumar said, we remove the ones that fail, as long as we maneuver out of the course of debris, and as long as we know exactly where things are so that we can take actionable insights to whatever scenarios might crop up.
Thank you, Hira. Now let's hear from Lee about Mercia Asset Management and why sustainability is important for you. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Lee Lindy, and I'm a venture capital investor at Mercia Asset Management, and amongst other things, I lead on space tech and space-related investments on behalf of Mercia's VCT funds. A little bit about me first. So I've taken a pretty unconventional route to working in venture capital. I've always been a bit of a science and technology geek and studied natural sciences at university. But after getting a science-based master's, I actually pivoted, decided I wanted to work in finance instead. And I joined the NHS's graduate management training scheme, qualified as an accountant before spending 7 years working in corporate finance at PwC. And then I joined Mercia 13 months ago, where I'm now based in our Manchester office and focus on investing in companies that are kind of at scale-up stage. In terms of Mercia, so we're a publicly listed asset manager. We pride ourselves on the fact that we invest in businesses based all over the UK, but especially companies based in the regions, which is really advantageous for us making investments in the space sector, as that ranges all the way from Cornwall up to the Shetland Islands. And in terms of funding that Mercia provides, we're sector agnostic generalist investors, and we invest right across a company's life cycle. So that means we have specific funding available for early stage startups, for scale-ups that have generated traction and looking to kick on and grow further. And then right the way through to private equity funding, debt funding, and Mercia also makes direct investments through the PLC's balance sheet. So what that means is, if you're a company looking for funding with an initial investment ask of somewhere between the £250,000 to £10 million mark, then Mercia might be able to help. With regards to sustainability, investing in sustainable businesses really is a core principle of ours here at Mercia. We've got a history of investing in and making a difference to the regions and delivering positive social impacts for our stakeholders. And sustainability has been and remains an integral part of our financial return motivation. To that end, we have a number of guiding principles that guide all of our investment decisions, which have been inspired by the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And for me, that includes a specific focus on generating longer-term sustainable economic growth through technological innovation, which I think is really relevant and really important for investments that we're looking to make in the space sector.
Thank you so much, Lee. Now, our audience would like to know how important are a business sustainability credentials when making investment decisions? Over to you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the short answer is that they're really important. I think for a bit of context, it might be helpful to explain what the day-to-day job of an investor actually is. So at a fundamental level, my job as an investor is to invest my shareholders' funds so that over time, I deliver for them and expect a return on their capital. Now, I suspect that everybody's heard the term no risk, no reward. So really the job of an investor is to make sure we make investments that appropriately take risks in order to generate decent returns for our own investors and shareholders. So here at Mercia, we take risk by investing in early stage companies. We review that over time, and with our support, that will ultimately help those companies to scale and grow and to create value. And at the point that we exit, we hope to increase the value of our shareholders' equity and generate a good return on the capital that we've invested. So we spend a lot of time evaluating and balancing risk and returns. But realistically, what we're trying to do is keep the risks for each investment as low as we possibly can, whilst delivering as high as a return as we possibly can. And to that end, at Mercia, we really strongly believe that sustainable business models not only reduce the risk of an investment, but ultimately leads to greater value creation opportunities and returns for companies over the longer term. And so therefore, like businesses, sustainability credentials are therefore really important to us as investors when making investment decisions. So in order to generate a return, we need to eventually exit our investments whether that's via a listing on the public markets, a sale to a private equity investor, or via an acquisition from a strategic corporate buyer. And to my mind, nobody's going to want to invest in our businesses if those businesses' supply chains are unnecessarily emit a lot of greenhouse gases, or if their manufacturing processes aren't sustainable over the longer term, for example. So for us, that means that we evaluate the ESG credentials of every company we consider making an investment in. We do that through spending a lot of time with management teams, really getting to grips with the businesses, their business models, their value chains, and we undertake independent due diligence on almost every investment that we make. And then so my job personally, I have to present the conclusions of all of this research to our investment committee, which ultimately approve or reject the investment opportunities that we take to them on behalf of our shareholders. And the bottom line is, if a business isn't sustainable, then we're just not going to be able to make an investment. And finally, and ultimately, there's a reputational impact for us here too at Mercia. So the last thing we want to be doing is investing in businesses which are unsustainable. It's not a good long-term business model for us. It doesn't do our reputation any good. And ultimately, it's just not something that we believe in. Okay,
thanks for that, Lee. Now I'm really pleased to welcome Jaya, who's the CEO of Project Vana. She just joined a couple of minutes ago, but yeah, I really want to hear from Jaya about, and she has a case study presentation for us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm just going to get my screen sorted out. Can you all hear me? I can't see anything, so if you can't.
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Fabulous. Right, so thank you so much for inviting me to talk about what we're doing with our afforestation with data platform called Vana. I am not an environmental scientist. I'm a physicist turned data scientist, and I've ended up working in corporate compliance, which is a bit of a twisted way around trying to save the planet. We're a social enterprise and we work in open data. All right, so I'm going to try and get the slides moved. There we go. Okay, right. So as everyone's probably already discussed, and I've come in late, it's fair to say that the world has woken up to the fact that we're in the middle of a climate crisis. And it also turns out that in order to do something about it, we've got to fix what we've already broken. You can see the quote that had hit the papers probably a few years back now, but most of you will know that trees don't grow overnight. There's a shortage of available land, and we should have been starting on this decades ago. Add to that there's 900 million hectares of land at least owned by private landowners that could help unlock all of the stuff that we need to be doing by sticking trees in the ground and rewilding. And there's a prize if we're very strategic about how we do our restoration work with nature. We could be 13 times more effective, and we should be able to help turn things around, or at least increase the level of damage limitation that we can do. So there's everything to play for and not a moment to lose. So you're probably wondering what our response was. We've called it Vana. Vana is a single Sanskrit word that embodies our vision where nature and humanity thrive together in abundance. And it sounds like, Nirvana, heaven, whatever you want to call it, but we kind of sense that there needed to be some way of connecting up all of the actions across the globe so that we actually make a difference and measure things properly. So we created an eco-transparency platform that would help somehow to accelerate planetary repair. But the key thing here is that we're using corporate activism to do it. Where do we start? Well, we actually started in human rights, monitoring compliance and non-compliance with the Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act here in the UK. That, if you're not aware, is the Transparency in Supply Chains clause, which seems to be a big thing these days with supply chains. But we realized that we could not achieve accountability without that transparency on the connections between companies, their suppliers, buyers, regulators, directors, investors. So we started modestly building an internet of connected entities, which doesn't trip off the tongue as much as IoT does, but nevertheless, it was necessary. We stitched together data from Companies House, open corporates, various different governments who were much better on the open data than others, Charities Commission. And then we started to stitch together the other data. And things got a bit more interesting when HM Land Registry decided to make their corporate land ownership data available for developers via Geovation, which is their accelerator. We managed to join that, and suddenly we were launched from human rights into environmental justice by adding another layer of data to our strata, not just about land ownership data, but also what would give us more visibility on what action to take. We were given data from Friends of the Earth to talk about the right land to plant trees in, and a whole heap more. Then we started to gather momentum by connecting up with specialists, by activists, social scientists. We used our own framework on corporate compliance. There's companies over 36 million who are very visible and want to make a difference, or want to be seen to be making a difference. Oh, hang on, that went up too far. I'll go that way. And then finally, we started to consult with policymakers to find out exactly how they wanted things measured, so that we can provide metrics, so that we can improve policy faster than we have been in the past. We were funded for a prototype back in the end of 2020, so that we could try and work out what we could learn from the land registry data. So we had some cuts of data that enabled us to learn a few things. Back then, everyone was talking about the woodland target for England. That means additional woodland being planted, 180,000 hectares by 2042. Based on the data that we had from Friends of the Earth and also HM Land Registry, we were able to identify that corporates, and I mean anybody that isn't an individual person, human type entity, corporates owned 130.9% of the land required to achieve the 2042 target for woodland alone. You can expand that more if you start to overlay more data sets, but critically, this represents only 5% of the total corporate land ownership in England, at least. So that's a good news, but of course there's devils in the detail and covenants and things like that that start to get in the way. However, we do know who to talk to, how much land they own, and exactly where to start with those conversations. We can break it down further, and of course you can cut the data many ways. We started to do it by region, so you can see that actually the southeast, where you've got prime real estate, they own the most land that could have a whole bunch of trees plonked on them, and southwest, which is where I live, follows closely behind. And then because open corporates, well, actually Companies House breaks things down by SIC code, love them or hate them, we can look at land ownership by sector of corporate entity. No surprises, agriculture, forestry, and fishing #1, but of course you've got mining and quarrying, and all the way down you can get at the bottom to accommodation and food service activities. And that is land that does not have a building on it, could be in the periphery. Okay, so you're probably wondering where space comes in, and actually, the truth is the data is dirty. If you've got companies who are self-reporting, well, that completely sucks. And the environment for both reporting and measuring is complex. We need to evidence the data independently and really understand how we're affecting emissions, if at all. This is where we came to a bit of a halt, and we literally, as a team, couldn't see the wood for the trees. We were just too close to the data and not able to see what was going on. Eventually started to look skywards. That was when we were introduced to Southwest Centre of Excellence, satellite applications, and from then we were introduced to many others. So we were able to start asking some decent questions, very basic questions, given that this is not our area of expertise. Oh, go back up. Okay, so our questions were very basic, and many of you may already know the answers. What can we see for different land sizes? We're talking about wagging the long tail of corporate land ownership environment. We are looking at sub-hectare all the way up to hundreds and thousands of hectares. What can we see at each level that would be useful to them? Is it useful? Can it influence behavior? Do we get the resolutions? My former life, I was a spectroscopist at the really micro nano level. So I was working with atoms and molecules. This is the whole other end of the spectroscopy scale. What can we see that is useful? Can we see emissions? Can we see changes? And is it timely enough? Trees, as I said, don't grow overnight. So quarterly or annual snapshots or biannual snapshots would probably do, provided we were getting the right information. And the biggest elephant in the room is it affordable? So I've been introduced, thanks to the work that you'll see in the next few slides, that there's a whole heap of data available. Can businesses who will be asset rich in the majority and not cash rich, can they afford to use the data that they would need to take action and see differences? In the meantime, we have, well, actually, gigabytes of imagery sitting on servers in power-hungry data centers. There must be a case in there somewhere. So as you can see, based on, these are not my slides, which is why I have to say thank you very much to Grey Consultants and Deloitte for putting all of this together so that we get a feel for what it is we're tackling. They had to take into consideration that we're a tiny social enterprise. We are 5 people with limited data storage. We're self-funded. We're also on a time limit that is set by the planet. We've got to move much faster. So they started to look at space, drones, geospatial, and also what the product might look like for our different audiences and the ecosystem of enterprises and organizations that we might need to plug into. Most of you will know this stuff already, but this was new to us in terms of what data was available and what we could plug into for various different levels of information that might be important to our corporate clients. You will also see that there is no silver bullet, not at all. But equally, there are niches we could fit into. If it is really true that 80% of consumers expect corporates to properly take ownership of the issue and deal with it, and then we're looking at the value of a ton of carbon, where it is now and where it was back in 2014, that's a bit of a leap. And also carbon trading markets, which are also burgeoning. But what we need to do is make sure this is actually meaningfully saving our planet and keeping us in an environment that we can breathe in. And yes, we can look at those different types of entities and say everyone who owns a particular asset is connected to the planet. If they own a building, they're connected. If they own land, of course they're connected. And if they have customers that depend on it, they're connected. One way or another, we will find a way with that. And there are workflows which I won't go through because I know that I've got a little bit of time there and not very much left. I'm happy to talk about this afterwards. So with all of this data swimming around, we know that the current market is in flux. Measuring impact is complicated. And we're going to have to try and find some use cases fast to work out where we can create the biggest difference using that lowest hanging fruit that everyone keeps talking about. What are our next steps? Well, I hope this is a race to the top. I don't care if someone saves the planet before we do. However, I do think that having a decent data infrastructure is critical so that we don't double count, that we're measuring something real, and that we don't end up going round and round in circles trying to work out which framework to fit our actions to. And on that note, I will end.
Thank you so much, Jaya. Really fantastic. Now, attendees, we're going to move shortly into the Q&A. So attendees, please keep asking questions. And also note that you can vote the one that you would like to be asked first. Now, I can see that some questions have already been submitted. So I will just fill the questions from the participants. And panelists, if you would like to answer a particular question first, please raise your hand. So the first one is, how does the space sector compare with other industries on sustainability and how can it improve? So I'd like to direct that one to Kumar, possibly, or Hira. Perfect.
Sure. So I think there's this impression at large that the space industry has such a huge direct atmospheric impact on things like carbon dioxide and nitrous oxides. And a space launch does release far more of these things than a long-haul plane flight, but we have to look at this in aggregate. If we look at the amount released by the entire aviation industry, the space industry does actually pale into insignificance. Now, the space industry is much more nascent with less of a visible impact. It's not seen and heard every day by everyone around the world. So Whilst sustainability hasn't been top of the agenda, I think there is a large scope for improvement, more so for the volume of near-Earth space, which is currently a casualty of this tragedy of the commons.
Thank you, Hira. We've had one coming in just now, which is Kumar. You've explained how you remove satellites yet to launch, but what about the parts that people currently don't claim their own?
Ah, that's an excellent question. So, excuse me. There are various studies, including by the major space agencies, that there are different types of space debris up there, and there is space debris out there which is typically left spent upper stages of rockets, which were launched by big governments or big space agencies. And depending on which studies you read, there's some argument, or sorry, some an approach, which is that if one started removing the bigger space objects which have been left in space, typically these, then one would make a substantial improvement in the risk of progressive degradation of the orbital environment. The question is who pays for it. So ultimately, it can only be done in one of two ways. Either governments step up to pay for it, because usually they've been the parties responsible for launching those rockets into space, or, and this is further down the road, and it's probably 7 to 10 years down the road, and it's questionable whether one can wait that long. But there is a school of, well, there are proposals out there to recycle some of that material which is in space and convert it into usable products, which can then be used for other things in space. That's a nascent industry. There's a lot of work and study work going on. The stuff which is smaller than the big space rockets, sadly, there's thousands of them up there, and most operators are quite happy to relinquish any responsibility for dealing with it unless their governments insist on it. So the pre-existing problem is hard to deal with at this point in time. There has to be incentivization for the commercial and institutional industry to actually try to find progressive solutions to that. There is no easy answer to that problem, but we can't afford not to even attempt to sort out the parts of this mess which have been created. I mean, we had the honor and privilege of hosting with the Space Applications Catapult His Royal Highness Prince Charles at the end of January. And he made a very interesting comment, which was, as I think you all know, he's been an advocate for dealing with the degradation of the Earth environment for many years or decades. But he also said, I think, I don't know if it's an accurate quote or not, and I might get shot for quoting him, but he basically said, we seem to have made a mess of the Earth's planet. Perhaps we should put into place now something which deals with the space environment and manage it in a better way, which is the gist of what he said. You can probably find his exact quote in one of the newspapers. So I think there's a recognition from various people, which is growing, that this is a problem, and we have to move on this. So we can't afford to say, oh, well, this is too complicated a problem, and just let things drift.
Thanks, Kumar, for this and for answering some of the questions already in the chat as well. Next one is, how do we ensure our supply chains are sustainable? Dominic, would you like to take it?
Certainly. I think just picking up on the point with regards to how does the space sector sit in terms of sustainability against others, I think a lot of other sectors, especially in mass transit, in automotive, have certainly enhanced their drive towards more sustainable materials in light of end of life and recyclability. I think, as any industry, we have challenges in growing the supply chain of more sustainable technologies. These are still very much in their infancy, but as previous presenters have already suggested, we live in this huge planet where resources are significant, but it's a case of finding the investment and then the subsequent development of those supply chains as we look to reduce the reliance on fossil-derived raw materials from a materials perspective and move towards a greener, cleaner, net zero supply chain.
Fantastic. Would we better investing in solution to global challenges on Earth rather than on space endeavors? So I know that Kumar already made some comments on the Q&A, thank you. But Lee, would you like to add something to it?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. I mean, what do we mean by better? Like better for who? Better over what time horizon are we talking about? When we think about sustainability, I can't remember the definition off the top of my head, but it's something around making decisions now for our short term which don't negatively affect people over the longer term. My personal opinion is that space-based businesses are helping us to address some of the most important challenges that we've got on Earth, both now and we will have over the longer term. So I think it's been mentioned a few times, but things like Earth observations is a really important part of that. So there are businesses out there and satellites up in orbit now, which are helping companies to track their carbon emissions, aid in humanitarian or disaster responses, track climate change, track deforestation, illegal shipping, that sort of thing. And those sorts of things, I would argue, are actually really important global challenges that we have on Earth right now, even though the solutions are actually being provided from space. And then just at a more broader level, there's actually plenty of capital out there available in the market to be investing in both companies that are focused on Earth and on in space. I think we just need to be making smart decisions around where we're deploying that capital to make sure we're solving the most important problems.
Thanks, Lee. Is the UK launch programme counter to UK leadership on climate change? If anyone would like to take this, otherwise I'll have to pick some.
Ozzy, let me attempt to reply. No, I don't think it's inconsistent. I think if you just look at what Lee just said about the importance of space-based systems to enable climate change monitoring by a whole variety of sensors, it's obvious you have to launch those satellite systems. There's loads and loads of applications for telecom, navigation, which all of us benefit from. So you have to launch these satellites, and unless you decide not to launch them and then you shoot yourself and you don't have those benefits, the question is whether the UK should actually create an industry which brings value, economic and social value, back to the UK across the whole ecosystem. So I think the answer is obviously yes, and the UK government has actually done a very good job, in my personal opinion, to foster that industry in the UK and encourage new launch service providers to come and establish themselves in the UK through a combination of national investment and FDI. So, and it's great to see the UK taking a leadership role in that regard.
Thanks, Kumar. Are satellites a good tool for holding companies to account on their sustainability policies? And can these be supported by AI and machine learning? Jaya, would you like to take this?
I'm speaking as someone who really hopes that satellites are a good tool, because at the moment it's so hard to see what impact is being made. I'm hoping that improvements with what can be monitored in terms of emissions from space will help us understand what's actually happening versus what is being reported. And if we can do that really quickly and provide that and make that available to companies, knowing that they do better if they know others are watching. So it's not just about having the data on a server, it's saying actually everyone knows it because it's available. It's the availability as much as it is having the technology up in the sky. So yes, I hope so is the answer.
Fantastic. And what is the cost per kilogram to remove space debris? And also, who should pay for it?
Let me have a go at answering the second question. Who should pay for it? Ultimately, it should be a combination of governments, institutions, and private satellite industry. Exactly who pays for what portion for what type of space debris, I think, is a is a negotiation and decision on the cost benefit analysis and who will derive benefit from that. And that discussion is already happening in various parts of the world, including here in the UK. As to how much it should cost per kilogram to remove a piece of debris, I'd probably have to plead the Fifth Amendment at this point in time in that regard. But if you ask me this question in about a year's time, I'll hopefully be able to give you a clear answer to that. Okay. But just in that regard, I mean, Mark Twain once said that there is lies, damn lies, and marketing. I think that was the phrase. And there are lots of marketing reports out there. But the general direction of those big reports from experienced analysts and consultants is that the in-orbit servicing market is worth more than 10 billion US dollars by the end of this decade. So there is a significant opportunity there. Now, whether you believe it is 10 or 15 or 8, I think is yet to be seen. But all of the external studies by independent organizations suggest that there is a very strong market out there. And then that should enable people to actually, in coming months and a year, to actually answer your first question in some degree as to what's the cost per kilogram. There is data out there, but I probably can't quote it for copyright reasons.
Thank you, Kumar. Hira, would you like to follow up, or should I move on to the...
Sure. I mean, I could maybe give a ballpark estimate for how much debris removal is going to cost. I think, understandably, it's going to be several orders of magnitude larger than launch. But I think the key business case is that this is going to come down. If I were to put a ballpark on where I see it right now, I would estimate that early emissions are going to be between £200,000 and £300,000 per kilogram removed. But yeah, time will tell, as Kumar said, and the price will definitely come down.
Thanks, Hira. What kind of returns do venture capitalists want to see, and in what time scale? Is it the same for a business that is more sustainable focused than financial return alone?
Yeah, that varies between different venture capital investors, different funds, and the stage at which you invest in. So, rule of thumb anywhere between 3 times money on money return, 5 times, 10 times if you go earlier. The big US VC firms like to make 50, 100 times their money on exits, but it really does vary depending on the risk appetite of your LPs and your shareholders and the thesis that you have as a venture capital fund. Generally, VCs look to hold we look to hold for between 5 and 7 years is kind of our investment horizon. So we like to get involved and be on a longer term journey with the companies that we invest in. And then the latter part of the question, I don't think there are any different expectations in terms of returns for businesses which focus on sustainability and which don't. I think our view is that you're more likely to get a much better return on your investment if you focus on a business which prioritizes sustainability from the start, rather than having to build it in at a later date.
If I may just jump in on that and add to what Lee said, I think you very roughly categorize investors into those who are looking at investing in the space sustainability, the broader space, in those who are looking at as strategic investors who probably have a shorter term return horizon, versus those who look at it as a portfolio investment, part of a portfolio investment. But what is interesting is in recent years, the whole notion of ESG orientated investment has become more and more important to many VCs and private equity houses and indeed pension funds. So I think we're going to see that those companies which can demonstrate a vision, a mission, and an implementation plan and a business plan to address these space sustainability problems, as well as obviously the sustainability problems relating to what's happening on Earth and the Earth's environmental degradation. We'll see a lot of investment coming in because there's a lot of capital out there, and ESG is actually a good motivator for those companies to come in.
Now our audience wants to hear from Hira. So does Lumi work with those space objects? What about less reflective surfaces? You're on mute, Hira. You're still on mute. Perfect, thanks. It seems to go back to mute. I don't know. Okay. Oh, never mind. We can come back to you. Maybe we can ask. We don't have much time, so we can ask one last question. And this is for everyone. Sorry, Hira, I don't know what's going on. But how does the UK compare on a global scale in terms of sustainability of its businesses? So whoever wants to take this lead, perfect. Oh, or Kumar.
I think in general the UK is one of the leaders in the world on all sustainability issues. But in the sector of space and space sustainability specifically, again, it is one of the leaders. But I might get shot by the UK Space Agency people who are maybe on this call, but I think they probably need to step up and push harder on a faster track basis, because other countries will sit up and listen, and obviously the UK has to work with like-minded nations. But if you look at it practically, of the 20,000 satellites which are projected to be launched over the next decade or so, that bunch of satellites, of which is many, is probably going to be launched by 5 or 6 countries. So it is a relatively small group of countries you have to persuade to come on board. And then, of course, all of those countries have to trade pushing for space sustainability versus maintaining the competitiveness of their industry going forward. But so we were very, very pleased to see in President Macron's address to the EU Council recently, he actually raised space sustainability as an issue and identified the Net Zero Space Initiative as actually an important one. So it's good to see political traction slowly at the high level beginning to happen. These things don't happen. The industry very rarely promotes is the initiator of dealing with this problem. It's usually governments or the public. And I think that is beginning to happen, but we need to accelerate that going forward.
Thank you, Kumar. Does anyone want to add? Dominic, please.
Yeah, I'd say from a materials perspective, the Europe leads the way in terms of the development of more sustainable materials. I think the UK has a lot to do in terms of growing its supply chain. We have a lot of agricultural waste that could be transformed into polymeric materials through through existing and maturing technologies. But I think there's a long way to go before the UK catches up with the rest of the world in terms of the onshoring or reshoring of more sustainable technologies.
I'd probably add to that just quickly. I'm just looking at the Sustainable Development Reporting. Apparently UK is in number 17. And if you're looking on the ground, I guess, on sustainable development goals, you've got Finland, Sweden, Denmark in the top 3. If we're doing better in space, that's great. We kind of need to make the 2 join up.
So thank you, everyone. With that, thank you, Kumar, Dominic, Hira, Jaya, and Lee for your insights and presentations. So we have had many questions from our audience, and don't worry, if your question went unanswered on the feed, we will do our best to come back to you in writing. And please give some feedback. I'm gonna launch a poll now, which is gonna appear at the bottom of the page. And there is one more session on space supply chain, as you can see from this banner. So sign up today. You'll see the details on the slide, and the link will be released on our channels as well. This talk is going to be streamlined online, but also we're going to deliver in person in Leicester. So if you want to attend in person, there's also that possibility. And thank you so much for being here today. We can't wait to see you at the next session. Thank you again to all the panelists.
Thank you, Asia.